This is Spare Time Repair, and this is the Sony CDP-35. I've been looking at a lot of vintage CD players recently, but no discussion of the format is complete without Sony. In keeping with their early players, it's much narrower than standard hi-fi separates, and the manufacturer's badge is miniaturized and crammed into the corner. This model was introduced in 1986, and I appreciate the voltage selector at the back in case I ever return to the UK. This was an eBay purchase, and the listing said that the tray opened and closed okay, but wouldn't read discs. The latter is true enough, but the tray also sounds clunky on the way in, and then won't stay closed. The plug prongs are pretty mashed up too, and although it still goes into an outlet, I'll need to replace the power cord, but only if I can get it playing. I have become slightly obsessed with vintage CD players recently. You may have guessed. The issue this one has with the tray not staying shut is very similar to the Technics CD player I looked at recently. That turned out to be a slack belt, but I'm not sure this has even got a belt. It's got a very tight fitting case, I can tell you that. I've never had this much trouble getting the case off something before. Oh, well, that would explain it. The disc clamp is completely disconnected. That can't be all that's wrong with it. Please tell me that's not all that's wrong with it. If so, it took me longer to get the case off than it did to fix it. Maybe not, because it shouldn't do that. Yeah, it's going to be the belt again. I can feel it slack. Like that Technics player, I think it's enough to take the tray in, but it's not enough to engage the lowering system. The Technics one had a metal insert in the tray that dropped down when the belt tightened up. This one has got these 3 pegs, so I think it's going to be that. Yeah, you can see the pegs aren't dropping down, the clamp's not dropping down. So that clunking noise when the tray closed must have been caused by the disc clamp, though how on earth that got dislodged like that, I can't imagine. Well, I suppose I can. It's not super secure. It's just a very small clip there that doesn't take much force to move it out of the way. So I've just unplugged it while I figure out how to remove the tray. I think I am going to take this disc clamp off. The laser looks very clean indeed, and we've got really good access to the sled rails if they need re-lubricating. There's a sticky globule at the end here. I think it's definitely worth redoing those. It's interesting that the motherboard is mounted upside down. So all the capacitors and chips, well, not all the chips obviously, but a lot of them are mounted on the bottom. There's no access panel at the bottom. So maybe that was done for testing purposes. It's easier to probe the underside of the board. So I'm wondering if the front panel needs to come off before I can remove the tray. Can't see any clips. So you can see here the voltage selector for the transformer. So that's a really nice design and something that could be pretty useful. I wish more devices did that. I'm just getting distracted now by other stuff, but it's got a nice metal linkage arm. And other players I've seen these have all been plastic. And replacing this power cord shouldn't be too difficult either. Just need to get this strain relief off and then solder simply onto this board. Well, I'm going to have to remove this front panel anyway because I want to give it a good clean. There's a couple of white marks on the front here that I'm hoping will come off. It's still got its original It's a Sony badge on here, which is nice. It's quite amusing to me that the compact disc logo is larger than the Sony logo. Even this digital label is bigger. So this could be a nice little player with the emphasis on little. I'm not sure how I feel about it not being standard hi-fi equipment width. In fact, when it turned up in the box, I thought, well, that can't be what I think it is, because the box was so small. It's also got very discreet feet on this. I think the trend going forward was to have those very large feet with the silver fronts, so things look good when they were stacked on top of each other. Alright, will this come off? Wow, I think that's the easiest front panel removal I've ever done. And there's a lot of slack on the cable. You don't even need to disconnect it. I suppose that's because it's difficult to disconnect because the board is upside down. So you can see in there now all the components mounted on the other side. I'll probably take that out later for checking bulging capacitors. And the leaf switch for detecting the tray status is mounted on the underside here, just in here. Then you've got the 3 motors. The one on the right is for the tray. then the disc spindle, and this one for the laser sled. Some pretty robust shock mounts as well. They've got springs and rubber grommets. There's this metal reinforcing skeleton to the front panel. Things were just made to a higher standard back then. So does this tray want to come out? Well, I didn't want to break anything, so I just downloaded the service manual, and it says to just bend back these 4 clips here. I don't like that. There is our very slack belt, which is obviously enough to pull the drawer in, but not enough to engage the disc. So it looks like this lever slides this forward, and then the posts drop down and leave the disc on the spindle. And that's operating very smoothly. Trouble is, the belts I've got are nowhere near as thick as this. This is pretty chunky. Well, hopefully they'll still do the job. This one's a little bit smaller. That still feels slack. Let's try this one. That feels better. So I'm pretty sure that's the only issue, assuming the laser is working okay. But before I reassemble and test it, I'm going to give everything a good clean. And if you look down here, you can see those pegs are on little springs, and they just get ramped up. And what I like about this design is that they feel solid when they're in the up position. Some other early players have similar supports, but you can push them down. And so when you insert a disc, it kind of feels spongy. I prefer this when you're inserting it onto a solid platform. I'd like to take this completely apart to clean it, but I can't see how this comes off these keyed posts here. Looks like they've been plastic welded down afterwards. So I'll probably have to just clean it on the surface as best I can. So I'm just going to remove this PCB from the front. So here's our VFD. I didn't really show it earlier, but it's not in the best condition. It's clearly less bright than it used to be, but I'm not going to try and revive it because I don't think it's worth the hassle and the potential damage. When I see a board like this, I'm always thinking about the potential of changing LED colours. So the play light is green and the pause is orange. Shuffle is orange. Program is green. And auto space is green. I mean, it might be nice to make a couple of those blue instead. And with this metal framework, this front panel is actually quite heavy. And these buttons are all hinged. And annoyingly, we've got a 2-layer lens. I normally like to submerge the front panels in water and give them a good scrub, but I'm going to have to be careful with this because water's going to get between those 2 panels. Right, let me give all of this a clean and then we'll start putting things back together. Well, I've actually just discovered that the inner layer of this lens peels off very easily, so I can fully submerge it after all. The front panel has come up well, but the 2 white marks on here wouldn't come off with soap and water, so I'm going to try and remove those with some alcohol. Sorry if you don't like squeaking sounds. There's still some small scratches left behind, but that looks better. Trays come up quite nicely as well. And I'm going to leave these LEDs alone for now, at least until I test that it's all working. So that's a potential future modification. This feels really smooth. I don't think there's any need to renew the grease on here. But some of this grease looks a bit claggy, so I'm going to remove that and replace it with some silicone grease. And while I've got it opened up, I'm also going to clean these rails. I'm just going to apply the very thinnest coat. So let's use some more crusty grease on this part here. I'm going to be a bit more generous with it here, since there was clearly a lot there before. I think I will flip this PCB over while I've got it open. Need to unscrew the RCA outputs as well. Well, I don't see any bulging capacitors, so I don't think there's anything I need to worry about. Here are all the adjustment pots for the tracking and the focus. The output jacks are quite corroded, so I'm going to give them a wire brush while I've got good access. I think this is the digital to analog converter. PCM54HP. Actually, before I put that back in, there's these clear lens covers for the LEDs. I think they go in like that. Now I've got to get the other buttons in the right place, and I think the skip buttons are on the top. This is a bit of a jigsaw puzzle. And these are the index search buttons. Very seldom used, and you won't find them on any CD players of recent times. I did wash this lens, but it's still sticky around the edges, so hopefully it'll stick down again. Well, that obviously wasn't as sticky as I thought. I think the PCB will hold it in. Yeah, those buttons all feel good and clicky. I should have sprayed some contact cleaner in there before I reassembled really, but hopefully it'll work anyway. Just going to remove this power button, just the cover. Let's give that a good clean. So this should just snap down. So now I just got to fit the disc clamp. So we're plugged in, ready to test. Here is our 1986 CD. It's still ejecting by itself, which it shouldn't, but maybe that's just the mechanism resetting. It's going to pop the drawer front back on. So you can see the display isn't the best. There's a few lines kind of missing, but still perfectly readable. Will it read the disc? Yes, it will. Alright, so I've connected it to the amplifier. Well, this album fades in, but I can already hear it. Interesting that it says scan when you're skipping through. That's interesting as well. So if you try to look for an index in a track that doesn't have it, it'll just fail and then restart the track. Just turn the volume down for copyright. But yeah, this has got an auto space feature, which will just leave a 2-second gap between tracks if you're recording onto a cassette, and perhaps you have a tape deck that searches for silence between tracks. The time cycles between the remaining time of the track and the album. Repeat one or repeat all. A-B repeat. Shuffle mode. So it's quite noisy searching for tracks. Will it return to the table of contents when I press stop? No. It's so strange to me that players from the 80s didn't do that. Maybe they just can't hold it in memory? Like, what is the point of displaying 0? Well, I almost forgot that we need to change the power cord. Actually, I need the tray to be open to get better access. So I'm going to power it off with the tray open. And hopefully pry out this strain relief. These things are always a nightmare. So I've eased the top clip out, but how do you access the bottom one? I think these things are just designed to be fitted and never changed. It's most of the way out. I bent the casing slightly, so I'm just going to snip it. It's not polarized, so I don't need to worry about that. There must be a technique I'm missing. Wow, so it does come apart, but you have to get the whole thing out before you can do that. Well, that didn't want to give up. And the other one's trapped under this brown wire, so that's going to be even harder. Whew. I'm worried that with all the heat I put in there, I've done something to the other side of this board. Let's see if I can release it. In fact, why didn't I do this in the first place? Well, to release that board, I think I've got to take the front panel off again. I was just being lazy, really. Alright, so now I can remove the linkage arm. Well, that's interesting. There's a rubber ring under there. What's that for? This piece below the board is plastic, so it can't be insulation. Is that moved from somewhere else? Or is it a spare belt? They look similar. Well, I'm glad I checked, because this is now a cold joint. It's come completely detached. So I'm just going to add some flux and reflow that. And the other one while I'm at it. Well, I've just retrieved this power cord from my dead Sony mini disc deck. And because it's a Sony, it uses exactly the same cord grip. And this one came out a lot easier than this one did. So I can use this new one in its place. And because this cord is kinked in exactly the same way, I can also feed it through nice and easily. So this cord wasn't soldered in, it had this connector. So I'm going to have to cut that off. But it gives me plenty of slack. In fact, I think that's upside down. The other one was in this way. But before I snap that in, I'm going to do the soldering. So I'll just nip this plug off. I'm going to make it a bit longer than the original was. I'm going to strip a fair amount off the end. In fact, I should do this before I feed it through. I think it's very important to tin these wires up first. I'm just going to make a sort of horseshoe shape. I'm just going to tape this wire down so that it's at the right angle for me. Just checking those bottom joints are still good, which they are. It's not inconceivable that it's a spare belt. Perhaps when this unit was being put together, somebody dropped it and it slid under there and they couldn't find it, so they just got a new one. Yeah, this board is well clear of this plastic piece at the bottom, so there's no way this was meant to be there. Gently bend this back into shape. Reinstall our linkage arm. We can reinstate the front panel. Well, hang on. Well, it's the same circumference as the belt that I replaced the original with. Might be too tight actually. Because it's thicker, it's putting more pressure on this spindle. So as nice as it would be to use it, I'm going to put this one back. So there's no reason why it wouldn't work, but we still have to test it. Will it read CDR? Yep, it's got no problem with that. So it should also have no problem with a modern CD. Love how quickly it reads it. So now we can reinstate the very tight cover, which is cleaned up okay. There's still some scuffs on there that I couldn't get off. Unusual to see a glossy cover. This cover's so tight it barely needs any screws. Finally, we just have the 3 screws for the front panel at the bottom. So yeah, I do really like this player, but it's not going to become my main device, I don't think. Mainly because of the form factor. I prefer a full width unit, and also the table of contents permanence, or lack of permanence, I should say. Just as an addendum on the table of contents thing, when you skip forward through a disc before you press play, it gives all the times of the tracks as you cycle through them. So it's clearly retaining that information in memory, and I really like this feature. Not many players do that, so that just makes it even more mystifying that it doesn't display the total time when you press stop. But otherwise it's a very nice looking device. I do really like the Sony design aesthetic. I always thought their stuff looked better than other brands, and this is undeniably a very nice player. But that's it for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.